Hi folks, in this video, we'll dive into how MacG might tackle the defamation lawsuit against him. There are several strategies he could use, but let's first recap how this all started. MacGyver McWevho, better known as MacG, and host of the popular podcast and Chill, is facing a defamation lawsuit for 1 million rand. This lawsuit is due to remarks made about Generations actress and author Rosie Motin during an episode of his show. The legal action also targets MacG's co-hosts, Sol Fenduka and Ghost Lady. Here's the background. In 2022, comedian Mongezi Mahlangu, also known as Tol Asmo, appeared on MacG's podcast. During his appearance, Tol Asmo discussed the impact of rape allegations made against him by model and actress Lerato Molloy. He claimed these allegations had severely affected his career and personal life, including the loss of brand deals. In that episode, Tol Asmo accused Rosie Motin, an activist for gender-based violence and LGBTQI rights, of coaching Lerato Molloy to damage his reputation. He also insulted her while speaking with MacG. As a result of these comments, Rosie Motin is suing MacG and his co-hosts for 1 million rand and demanding the removal of the podcast episode from YouTube. According to Briefly News, Bala Duma, the CEO of the podcast, confirmed that the case will proceed to court. So, what are the possible defenses MacG and his team might use? Here's a rundown. 1. Truth justification. The podcast could argue that Tol Asmo's statements about Rosie Motin were true. If they can prove these claims are factual, they might argue that the statements aren't defamatory because they are based on truth. 2. Opinion defense. They might argue that Tol Asmo's comments were his personal opinions rather than statements of fact. In many places, opinions are protected and not considered defamatory if it's clear they are opinions. 3. Qualified privilege. This defense could apply if the statements were made in a context where Tol Asmo had a right or duty to share the information, and the podcast had a duty to broadcast it. However, this defense may be weakened if the statements were made with malice or reckless disregard for the truth. 4. No editorial control. The podcast could argue that they didn't endorse or agree with Tol Asmo's statements and had no editorial control over the content of his comments. They might claim they are not responsible for the content expressed by guests. 5. Responsible journalism. They might argue that they acted as responsible journalists by providing a platform for discussion on matters of public interest and that they took reasonable steps to verify the information presented. 6. Absence of malice. The podcast could argue that they didn't act with actual malice, meaning they didn't know the statements were false or act with reckless disregard for the truth. They would need to show they had reasonable grounds to believe the statements were true. 7. No serious harm. The podcast might argue that the statements didn't cause significant harm to Rosie Motin's reputation. If they can show the impact of the statements was minimal, it could weaken the defamation claim. Each of these defenses would need to be tailored to the specifics of the case and the legal standards in the jurisdiction. Folks, let's talk about a case that's pretty similar to the MacG lawsuit. It's Sad Miller v. The Sunday Times, 2012. Background. So Sabby Miller, a major brewery, decided to sue the Sunday Times newspaper for defamation. Why? Because of something said by a guest columnist, not one of the newspaper's regular staff. This guest columnist had some harsh words about Sad Miller's business practices, and Sad Miller didn't take too kindly to it, claiming it was defamatory. Key points. Guest columnist. The controversy stemmed from statements made by a guest columnist. This wasn't a regular staff writer for the Sunday Times. The Sunday Times argued that they didn't have control over or endorse the guest columnist's views. They said they were just providing a platform for a range of opinions and didn't necessarily back everything the guest said. Court decision. The court sided with the Sunday Times. They emphasized that as a publisher, the newspaper wasn't responsible for what the guest columnist said, especially if it was clearly an opinion and not something the paper endorsed. The key point was that the newspaper didn't control or back the guest's statements, so they couldn't be held liable for any alleged defamation. Significance. What's important here is that publishers or broadcasters can defend themselves in defamation cases related to guest content by showing they didn't have editorial control or endorse those opinions. It really drives home the idea that there's a clear line between the content created by the publisher and what's said by guest contributors. All right, folks, let's look at a couple of cases that show how opinions can sometimes sidestep defamation claims. While we won't dive too deep, these examples will give you a good sense of how opinions are treated under the law. 1. LaRue v. Day, 2011. This case involved a comment made on a blog, and the South African Constitutional Court stepped in. The court made it clear that opinions, especially on public matters, are protected under freedom of expression. They drew a line between statements of fact and opinions. Essentially, opinions are less likely to be actionable unless they're implying false facts. 2. Murray v. Biggs, 2007. In this case, the court looked at comments made in a review or critique. The comments were framed as opinions rather than factual statements. The court decided that these didn't amount to defamation. The key point here is that when people are expressing opinions, especially in contexts where it's expected, those opinions don't carry the same weight as factual claims. So in South Africa, for an opinion to be seen as defamatory, it generally needs to include or imply false factual assertions. Just sharing a personal belief or viewpoint isn't usually enough to be considered defamatory. It's all about whether the statement can be seen as a factual claim rather than just an opinion.